If you grew up in the evangelical world, you were likely handed a specific theological premise from a very young age, the idea that God is a perfect being of infinite, unconditional love. But that premise carries a heavy contradiction. You were also taught that your deeply compassionate agnostic neighbor, or a devout Buddhist living a life of peace, is destined for eternal torment. Under this traditional framework, their condemnation has nothing to do with their character. They are punished for lacking the correct doctrinal vocabulary or for failing to recite a specific transactional prayer before they died. You look around your daily life and see a discrepancy. The secular neighbors and coworkers outside your church walls often demonstrate more radical love and patience than the leader standing behind the pulpit. This paradox forces you into a corner. To accept this version of salvation, you have to accept that God appears less merciful than the humans he created. Psychologists call this a moral injury. It occurs when your natural human empathy expands beyond the strict borders of your religious doctrine. This model frames divine judgment as an administrative technicality. Salvation functions like a cosmic bureaucrat grading a multiple-choice exam, where a life of kindness can be rejected based on a single incorrect answer. To protect this dogma from the reality of the good people around them, believers often build thick, protective psychological walls. They have to isolate their beliefs from their observations. Eventually, the friction between rigid theology and lived reality becomes too heavy. When those psychological walls crack, many people choose to walk away from their faith entirely to save their own conscience. This gatekeeping view of heaven forces a choice between theological loyalty and human empathy. It ends up penalizing the very kindness that many religions claim to promote. In the 18th century, a scientist and philosopher named Emanuel Swedenborg looked at the reality of the spiritual world and rejected the exclusive dogmas of his era. His complex view of the afterlife is illustrated in his most famous work, Heaven and Hell. Swedenborg replaced the idea of transactional salvation with a concept he called dominant love. He argued that heaven is populated based on the inner intent of a person's heart and their lived charity. Under this lens, your character is more important than your ability to pass a doctrinal test. This framework suggests that divine mercy is extended to everyone, regardless of the cultural or religious labels they wear on earth. By prioritizing the intent of the heart over the precision of the creed, this framework addresses the root of the moral injury. It suggests a God who values human kindness more than religious membership. Swedenborg made a disruptive observation about this. He noted that people outside the traditional church often step into the spiritual world more readily than religious insiders. The reason is psychological. Those outsiders haven't spent decades forming the rigid, defensive walls required to maintain exclusionary beliefs. Without the influence of institutional rules shaping their worldview, an outsider's heart remains open to universal human kindness. For Swedenborg, lacking a traditional religious vocabulary is a distinct advantage. It prevents the formation of those rigid walls that can isolate a person from their own natural compassion. This heart-based framework is built on a very old foundation. When you look past the heavy iron gates of modern religious structures to the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 25, you see this exact blueprint. Jesus' actual metric for judgment focuses on tactile, real-world charity. He asks if you fed the hungry and cared for the sick. He does not ask for a theological diploma or a specific sinner's prayer. The ultimate rule of this universal framework is simple. Doctrine without active charity is an empty shell. Love is the living core. If your core desire is to love your neighbor and act with integrity, you are already living the life of heaven. You don't need to wait for a religious institution to grant you permission. When you began questioning religious exclusivity, your conscience remained intact. It was expanding to recognize a much grander reality. Human empathy and spirituality are not at odds. Heaven is a magnificent, universal tapestry, and love is the only required membership.